177. This song has only got one verse, so let's sing it twice. There's something about that name. To me, it's a wonderful song. It talks about Jesus. So let's sing that verse twice. Jesus, 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 there's just something about that name. Master, Savior, Jesus, like the fragrance after the rain. Jesus, 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 let all heaven and earth proclaim. Kings and kingdoms will all pass away, but there's something about that name. Jesus, 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 there's just something about that name. Master, Savior, Jesus, like the fragrance after the rain. Jesus, 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 let all heaven and earth proclaim. Kings and kingdoms will all pass away, but there's something about that name.
Appreciate it. That's a good song to remind us that, we come in here on Wednesday nights as a little more laid back. We just kind of talk about, verse by verse through the Bible kind of stuff. But we're here to worship Jesus, however we do it, whether it's preaching a sermon or verse by verse Bible study or singing or whatever it is. We're here to worship Him, and I hope we never, ever forget that. I appreciate you being here. Look in Job chapter 38. Here's the goal. Last week we covered about 6 or 7 chapters, it seemed. Tonight we're going to try to get through 2. We'll try to do chapter 38 and 39. And then next week we'll try to wrap it up. This to me is the good part. Finally, God speaks to Job. Job has been wrestling with, why is God not speaking to me? Why is God not responding? Why am I not having a dialogue with God? And finally, God shows up and speaks. And He's going to give Job revelation that Job has been demanding since the very beginning. If you look back to chapter 13, verse 22, chapter 31, Job has been saying, I pretty much demand answers. I want to know. And so finally, God is going to show up. Now, and if you remember several weeks ago, we talked about Job cried out for a referee, a middleman. And he said, God is holy, and I don't even know if I can understand God or if He'll talk to me. So if I can just have somebody to mediate. When you get to chapter 38, there's no need for that. God is going to speak directly to Job, and Job is going to have an opportunity to speak directly to God. Now, what God does not say is just as equally as important as what God does say. And I want you to think about this as we go through chapter 38 and 39. What's Job been begging for answers for the whole time? It started in chapter 1 and 2. Job lost everything and he's suffering. And so what's Job been asking for? Why am I suffering? Why am I doing that? I'm innocent, so why am I suffering? Here's what God doesn't say. Nowhere does God mention suffering. Nowhere does God say, here's why you're going through this. Here's why all this is happening to you. He gave no explanation for suffering. He gives no explanation for the problem of evil. That's one of our big questions. Why does evil exist? Why does that happen in this world? God doesn't talk about any of that. He does not defend himself against Job's charges. Job has been saying, God, you're unjust. It's the punishment's not fitting the crime. In other words, God doesn't answer that. He makes no comment on that retribution type attitude. God doesn't talk about that. He doesn't say, Job, you've been wrong. I don't operate on blessing people that do well and cursing people that do bad. He doesn't talk about that. Here's what God does. He just reveals himself to Job in a greater degree than Job and his friends knew. That's what he did. He reveals himself on a deeper level. And so so here's what I want you to think about. When you're struggling or going through problems or difficulties and you're asking God, why me? God normally doesn't answer that. He's normally not going to say, here's why you're suffering. Here's why you lost your job. Here's why your health is bad. Here's why God doesn't usually give those answers. Here's what he does do. He does start talking to you and start relating to you on a deeper level than you had been relating to him previously. That's what he does. And so in this particular case, Job doesn't get any of them answers. So he's waited this whole time. And he's wanting to talk to God so he could say, God, why? And God say, okay, here's why. But God doesn't do that. He's just revealing himself in a deeper degree than they had known him before. And here's what happens. This is what's going to happen to us. When God reveals himself on this deeper level, I could say silences them, but in a Polk County, Floyd County way, it shuts them up. God, we know you. This is the way you operate. This is the way you do things. And now God's going to show up and reveal himself on a deeper level. And when he does, they don't have anything else to say. And what he's going to do by doing that is reveal himself as the only real wise person that there is. All three friends, and then Elihu when he came on later, all those friends thought that they understood God better than the other one. And as they came, succeedingly in that line of talking to Job, each one of them thought, I understand this better, so I'm going to tell you this. And now God shows up, and God is going to show them that in the grand scheme of things, the only real wise person is him. So don't think you know everything about God. Now, here's what happens in chapters 38 and 30, or actually chapters 38 through 41. If you want to take time to count these up, I did not. I relied on other people that took time to count these up. There's 77 unanswerable questions that God asked Job. And that's what I've been trying to build up to this whole time. It's okay to question God. God didn't, he doesn't get on to Job he doesn't say, why were you doubting me? Why were you questioning me? Why were you asking? He doesn't do all that stuff. He just starts asking questions himself. And there's 77 of them from chapter 38 to chapter 41 that Job has no answer to. And so what I'm telling you is it's okay to question God. It's okay to ask him things. He's probably not going to answer you. He's probably going to further do this kind of Socratic method with you in your life where he's going to ask you things and point out things to you that you really have no answer for, which is what happens here. He does not defend himself. This whole time, Job has been kind of prosecuting God. God, you're this, you're doing this. God doesn't do that. Instead of defending himself, God now shows up and takes on the role of the prosecutor himself. And he starts asking Job these questions. It's like Job's on the stand now, and God's asking these questions that Job can't answer. In doing that, he proves something to Job and then to us, because this is meant for us too. He proves that Job is both ignorant and impotent. That he doesn't know as much as he thinks he does. He thinks he's got God figured out. And that's what we do. We put God in these boxes, and we think that God always operates like this. And we think churches have to operate in a certain way. Families have to operate in a certain way. Evangelism has to happen in a certain way. Music has to happen in a certain way. Outreach has to happen in a certain way. Mission work has to do it a certain way. You can't control God in a box like that. God proves to us that we don't understand him. And so what he's going to do in especially chapters 38 and 39 is talk about nature. And here's what he's going to prove to Job. Job, you don't even understand basic nature things. And so if you can't understand basic nature things, then there's certainly no way you're going to understand how I relate to mankind. And so in chapters 38 and 39, it's all about the nature and about nature. And in doing this, he's going to prove to Job and all those friends that God is the only really wise one. So look at verse 1 in chapter 38 because it sets up something. And I don't know if you've ever thought about this. I do when I read this verse because there's a very vivid picture that comes in my mind when I read verse 1. It says, "Then the Lord answered Job out of a whirlwind," a storm. That's what whirlwind is talking about, a storm. Storms are symbolic of God's disturbing presence. That's what they do. Thunder and lightning is God's disturbing presence. Around Mount Sinai and all that, it's God's presence. It's scary. So here's what I'm thinking. You ever thought about from this point of view, who's still here? Job's friends. I believe they're still here because it comes right on the heels of Elihu's speech, and God speaks to him. And so every one of these friends have been talking to Job, and they've been saying to Job, God's going to get you if you don't repent. If you don't do right, you've sinned, God. So God's punishing you because you sinned. You need to do right. I think as soon as the storm happened, I think those friends probably start high-fiving each other like, yeah, now God's fixing to get Job. Here's the punishment coming. That's what they thought. They thought, okay, finally God is going to show up and punish this guy and prove us all right. I think that's what they thought. And so Job now is going to enter into something that's truly life-changing for him. Because I think the friends thought that God was fixing to get him with a lightning bolt, and God has different plan. So look at verses 2 and 3. Who is this that darkens counsel by words without knowledge? Now gird up your loins like a man, and I will ask you, and you instruct me. This is the way God started this. He starts with a challenge for all 5 human beings that's been debating so far. Job and those 4 friends. He starts and he just gets right after them. And look what he says. Who darkens counsel by words without knowledge? Now God says, gird up your loins like a man. Man up. And I'm going to ask you things and see if you can teach me something. In other words, here's what God is saying. You guys have been just clamoring on and on and on about truths about me that simply aren't true. You guys don't know. And so now get yourself ready because I'm about to ask you some questions. We're about to enter into this dialogue, and I'm going to see just how much you really know. Job should have defended God's justice rather than denying it. And so this is where really God's going to get after. Job has an inadequate revelatory knowledge of God. In other words, he doesn't know as much as he thinks he knows. So what does that teach us? Every believer, every child of God needs to be really slow to assume that we know God's will for somebody else. You don't know that. You can't definitively say this is what God's telling you to do. I have seen in my life, I've seen this where older pastors, or they weren't a pastor, they're just a preacher, a lay preacher in the church. I have seen older preachers in the church go to a teenager's house in the middle of the night, wake the family up by knocking on the door and ringing the doorbell, and they come to the door, and the preacher says, I need to see your son. And he says, well, he's sound asleep. We'll go wake him up. They wake him up, and the preacher says, God's just sent me over to tell you you're called to preach. And I'm like, that's just insane to me. And so what's that guy do? Next Sunday he says, God's called me to preach. And he preaches a couple little messages here and there at the home church. And he just fades away. It just fizzles out. Because it was really not God's calling as his. We cannot presume to know God's will for somebody else. And that's what God is saying in those two verses. That you guys have been just rambling on and on and on about what you think you know about me. But in reality, you don't have a clue. And so it's, you know, God has a right to intervene in the affairs of man. And so we don't know why he does it. And we don't know for what purpose he does it. If the person that God intervenes in their life, if they take the time to draw closer to God, then God will reveal his purpose to them, not to somebody else, really. And so that's kind of the way God is setting us up. He's saying, listen, I got a challenge for all you guys. And here's my challenge. Now he's going to start in verse 4. And he's going to start, and I'm just going to go through a couple of these. We certainly don't have time to go through all 77, but you'll get the gist of it. God is going to break down Job blow by verbal blow. And he's going to succeed where the friends failed. And so here's question number one. And let me say this. This is a oral science examination. This is what's about to take place. God is going to give Job an oral science examination. And I mean, just by way of questioning, he's going to cover these topics. He's going to cover the areas of cosmology, oceanography, meteorology, astronomy, zoology, climatology. He's going to cover all that. And so he's just going to go question by question with Job and cover all those topics just so Job will see how much he does not know. So look at question number 1 in verse 4 through 7. Where were you when I laid the foundation of the earth? Tell me if you have understanding. Who set its measurements, since you know? Or who stretched the line on it? Or what were its bases sunk? Or who laid its cornerstone? When the morning stars sang together and all the sons of God shouted for joy. In other words, here's question number 1, the origin of the earth. That's question number 1. So he says, okay, Job, let's get this oral science examination started because you think you know everything. And God is kind of facetious in this. Look at what he says in verse 4. Tell me if you have understanding. Who set its measurements, since you know? Since you know everything, you tell me these things. In other words, God's point was, since Job was absent when God created the earth, then Job lacked information that God had that enables him to govern the earth as he wishes. That's what he's saying. I made this thing. Where were you when I created the earth and laid its foundations and set its base and did all these things? Where were you at? Because since you were not there, you don't have the information I have that gives me the authority to govern the earth like I do. So that's question number 1. The phrase sons of God in verse 7 may refer to angels. In this context, also may refer to stars, since he's talking about cosmology, really. Morning stars, maybe the stars or planets, like Venus and Mars. Could be angels, I don't know. Most conservative commentators believe he's referring to stars, literal stars. But anyway, that's question number 1. Question number 1 is, where were you when I created the earth? Let's talk about cosmology. Look at question number 2 in verse 8. Starting in verse 8, or who enclosed the sea with doors? When bursting forth it went out from the womb. When I made a cloud its garment and thick darkness its swaddling hand, and I placed boundaries on it and set a bolt in doors. Verse 11, and I said, thus far you shall come, but no further, and here shall your proud waves stop. Here's question number 2, oceanography. In other words, here's the question, where were you when I created the oceans? Let's talk about the origins of the ocean. First of all, let's talk about cosmology. When I created the earth, where were you? You don't have a clue. Second of all, what about when I made the ocean? I told the waves it could only come this far. I carved it out like this. Where were you when that happened? You know, if you know everything, tell me. Show me, you know, what you know. Then he goes down to verse 12. Here's question number 3 in verse 12. Have you ever in your life commanded the morning and caused the dawn to know its place, that it might take hold of the ends of the earth, and the wicked be shaken out of it? It's changed like clay under the seal, and they stand forth like a garment. Verse 15, from the wicked their light is withheld, and the uplifted arm is broken. Here's question number 3. Job, have you ever caused the sun to rise? You know, have you ever caused the morning to dawn to break? And thereby sustaining the earth. Have you ever done that? And that phrase, have you ever, that's going to occur over and over and over again. In other words, it's questions that God is asking Job that Job's not going to have an answer for. I mean, he probably does have an answer. I was not there. I don't know is the correct answer. But he is trying to get Job to understand that our job is not to question the knowledge of God or the grace of God or the reasoning of God. Our job is to submit to His divine justice and just let it ride and just have faith that He knows better than we do. That's the whole point. The dawn of every day, you know, where were you when I did all of that? Look at verse 16. Here's question number 4. In verse 16. Have you entered into the springs of the sea, or walked in the recesses of the deep? Have the gates of death been revealed to you, or have you seen the gates of deep darkness? Have you understood the expanse of the earth? Tell me if you know all this. In other words, you're ignorant of the underworld. God calls it the springs of the sea, the gates of death, the scope of the earth. He said, Job, you don't know about all that. Now, I told you there were 77 questions in these chapters, and if you've noticed, there's multiple questions in each one of these categories. So in oceanography, there might be 2 or 3 questions. In cosmology, there might be 2 or 3 questions. There's not 77 categories. There's 77 questions total. But he's saying, Job, you're also ignorant of the underworld. You don't know. You just don't know that, you know, where the scope of the earth is. Why does Job not know that? Because Job's never seen it. And so he doesn't know. You get to verse 19, here's question number 5. In verse 19, where is the way to the dwelling of light? In darkness, where is its place? That you may take it to its territory, and that you may discern the path to its home. You know, for you were born then, and the number of your days is great. In other words, here's question number 5. Job, you don't know where the sun goes when it sets. You don't know where the sun hides or where the darkness comes from at sunset. He said, you don't know any of that stuff. You know, here Job is saying, I understand God. Here all those friends are saying, we understand God. We're speaking for Him. We're telling you, Job, what's going on. And Job says, you guys don't know anything. You don't know the answers to these really basic questions. Now, we're going to go on to the, and by the way, these little sets of questions, they're called strophes. That was the first strophe, and there are 5 of them. Now we're going to the second set of strophes, and in this second set, he's going to change topics a little bit, and you're going to see. Actually, look at verse 21. You know, for you were born then, and the number of your days is great. That's showing that God is the master of sarcasm, to be honest with you. It's a very sarcastic thing to say. Now, look at verse 22, because here's the second set. We're going from kind of the big, you know, cosmological picture of the origin of things. Now we're going down to the day-to-day activities. You know, every day, what happens every day. So look at verse 22. Have you entered the storehouses of the snow, or have you seen the storehouses of the hail, which I have reserved for the time of distress, for the day of war and battle? Where is the way that light is divided, or the east wind scattered on the earth? In other words, the next subject is what? Weather. He's talking about snow and hail and weather. And he's describing heavenly storehouses. Light here, probably in this context, refers to lightning. He says, you don't know where I store. He said, Job, where do I store the hail and the snow and the lightning to send it when it's needed? You don't know that. You just don't know. What do you think Job's going through about right now? Because he'd been a talkative little fella for 37 chapters, and now he's pretty much. I mean, if you notice, there's no answer. Job's not refuting any of this. He's not arguing. He's not talking. He's just sitting back listening, like your parents scolding. What do you have to say for yourself? Then he gets to verse 25. And he says, who has cleft a channel for the flood or a way for the thunderbolt, to bring rain on land without people, or a desert without a man in it, to satisfy the waste and desolate land, and to make the seeds of grass to sprout? The seventh strophe, this seventh topic, describes rainstorms and lightning. The channel for the flood, I think what he's describing is the channel or the path through the sky that the rain comes. That the atmospheric stuff comes down. He said, where were you when I made all that? Verse 28. Has the rain a father, or who has begotten the drops of dew, from whose womb has come the ice and the frost of heaven, who has given it birth? Water becomes hard like stone. The surface of the deep is imprisoned. So the next strophe, this eighth one, is... it's a very subtle thing. It's mild provisions of moisture. He's talking about dew and that kind of thing. Then he goes to verse 34. I'm sorry, verse 31. Can you bind the chains of the Pleiades, or loose the cords of Orion? Can you lead forth a constellation in its season and guide the bear with her satellite? Do you know the ordinance of the heavens? In other words, constellations. God said, let's talk about constellations. In other words, to further impress on Job his lack of insight and his lack of knowledge, he says, let's talk about these constellations. Can you unloosen the belt of Orion? Can you handle all that? It's things that Job just, he's left speechless. Verse 34, can you lift up your voice to the clouds so that an abundance of water will cover you? Can you send forth lightnings that they may go? Who has put wisdom in the innermost being? This goes down through verse 38. In other words, the clouds. He's talking about clouds. Cirrus clouds and cumulus clouds and nimbus clouds. Who made all those things? And this is kind of the... And so... that goes along that lines of have you ever done these things? Now he's going to shift in the last part of chapter 38, and now there's a subtle shift in God's argument. At first he's like, have you ever done these things? Have you ever created a sun? Have you ever brought a morning to light? Have you ever made it rain? Have you ever stored up the lightning? Have you ever made it flood? Have you ever done these things? And now when we get to verse 39, his question is going to be really, do you know? Do you know these things? Not have you ever created them, but do you know about them? And so the 11th one is in verse 39, and he is going to turn to the animal world now. He's going to mention 6 mammals and 4 birds. Only one of them is domesticated. He mentions the horse in here. It's the only domesticated one that you have. So there's 6 mammals, 4 birds. And he is going to mention, we'll look at verse 39. Can you hunt the prey for the lion? Satisfy the appetite of a young lioness? So here's the categories of animals that he's going to go through. And this is going to go through chapter 39. He's going to talk about ferocious animals. And he's going to ask Job a question. Do you know this about those ferocious animals? Or can you do this? He's going to ask about the helpless animals. He's going to ask about the shy ones, the strong ones, the bizarre ones, the wild ones. And he'll say, Job, did you know this? Or can you do this? So the first animal that God selected as examples of his creation are the lion, and then look at verse 41, the raven. He mentions the lion and the raven. And so here, again, God's question is, do you know? Do you know? And so look at the question. Do you know how those creatures provide food for themselves? In other words, can man explain that? Sure, they hunt and all that, but what gives them the instinct? What gives them the ability? What allows them to do that? How do those animals provide for themselves? Job, do you know that? Do you know what instinct they use or any of that kind of stuff? Then you go to verses 1 through 4. Look at verse 1 through 4. Now, he uses some bizarre animals, in my opinion, but, I mean, God can do what he wants to do. But look at verse 1. Do you know the time the mountain goats give birth? There's that question. Do you know? And so you're going to talk about mountain goats. Do you know how mountain goats bear their young? Do you know? And then at the last part of verse 1, do you observe the calving of the deer? So he said, do you know how mountain goats birth their young and how the deer calve for themselves? Look at verse 5. Who sent out the wild donkey free, and who loosed the bonds of the swift donkey? To whom I gave the wilderness for a home and the salt land for his dwelling place. He scorns the tumult of the city, the shoutings of the driver he does not hear. He explores the mountains for his pasture and searches after every green thing. So the second animal he brings us, a wild donkey. And here's what he's asking Job. Do you know how the wild donkey is able to survive such harsh conditions? That's what he's describing in those 3 verses. Job, do you know? Do you know how the wild donkey can do that? In verse 9 through 12, he changes. Will the wild ox consent to serve you? Or will he spend the night at your manger? Can you bind the wild ox in a fur with rope? Or will he harrow the valleys after you? Will you trust him because his strength is great? And leave your labor to him? Will you have faith in him that he will return your grain? So the next animal is a wild bull, an ox. It's untamable. He says, Job, do you know why? Do you know why that the wild bull is untamable? Do you know why that exists? And then he goes on to the bizarre. Look at verse 13. The ostrich's wings flap joyously with the pinion and plumage of love, for she abandons her eggs to the earth and warms them in the dust, and she forgets that a foot may crush them, or that a wild beast may trample them. She treats her young cruelly as if they were not hers. Though her labor be in vain, she is unconcerned, because God has made her forget wisdom, and has not given her a share of understanding. When she lifts herself on high, she laughs at the horse and its rider. In other words, Job, do you know why the ostrich is so stupid? That's what he's asking. And then he says, the ostrich is unlike other animals. It does not take care of its young. It just leaves them there. It don't know if somebody's going to step on the egg, if a wild animal is going to come get them. It just lays the egg and abandons it. It goes all that work to conceive and lay an egg, and it just takes off. Job, do you know why they're so dumb? Do you know why? In other words, this is a zoological lesson. Job, do you understand all this? And no, he does. I mean, we have zoologists and people have PhDs in zoology and botany and all this kind of stuff, and they can say, and they'll say to you, yeah, an ostrich will lay its eggs and leave. Yeah, but why? Why does it do that? Anybody ever talked to an ostrich and figured out why? Anybody can observe it. That's what science is. It's observing it. I can observe it, and I can say, this is what this animal does. I can look at this mountain goat and say, man, this mountain goat, thrives in this environment. This wild donkey thrives in these rough environments. I can observe that and say, this is what takes place, but do I know why? Do I know why it's able to do it? And then you can give some cursory answer like, yeah, well, they got hooves and they got this or that, and they're built like that. That's observable things. But what's going on in those animals' minds and instincts? That's what God is saying. God said, I made them to do this, and you don't know why. I did it. And you don't know why, and I'm sure God has a reason for doing it, but we don't know. Then he goes into verse 19. In verse 19, look at what he brings up. Do you give the horse his might? Do you clothe his neck with a mane? Do you make him leap like locusts? So he's going to, from there to verse 25, he's going to talk about a horse. The behavior of the horse in a lot of situations, which God elaborated on here, is beyond human comprehension. Look at some of them. Verse 21. He paws in the valley and rejoices in his strength. He goes out to meet the weapons. He laughs at fear and is not dismayed. He's not turned his back from the sword. The quiver rattles against him, the flashing spear and javelin. With shaking and rage, he races over the ground. He does not stand still at the voice of the trumpet. Often as the trumpet sounds, he says, aha, and he scents the battle from afar, the thunder. In other words, why in the world? And he's not obviously not talking about guns here. He didn't have guns. He's talking about arrows and spears, that kind of thing. But why does a horse not fear that? Why does it just charge right in? You get on a horse, you're in a battle, in a cavalry battle in 1800, and the other side's shooting at you. You get on your horse, you just run. The horse just goes straight for the bullets. It has an uncanny knack for no fear. And God says, Job, do you know why they do that? Do you know what gives them that? And obviously he doesn't know. And so again, God is just going through all this series of things to say, I created these for a purpose that you don't understand. You've been running your mouth talking about me in all these areas, but you have no idea what I'm doing. Look at verse 26. Is it by your understanding that the hawk soars, stretching his wings toward the south? Is it at your command that the eagle mounts up and makes his nest on high? On the cliff he dwells and lodges, upon the rocky crag and inaccessible place. From there he spies out food, he sees it from afar. His young ones also suck up blood, and where the slain are, there he is. In other words, Job, even the hawk and the eagle are weird and unexplainable. Again, a scientist can say, a zoologist can say, an ornithologist can say, eagles build nests up high. We have all these eagle cams on Facebook, and people watch these eagles, build these nests and have these eggs on. And so you can get a zoologist in here and say, tell me about eagles. They say, well, eagles soar real high. They're the highest climbing bird. They make nests up on the mountains, and but if you say, why? Why do they do that? They have no answer for that. I mean, an eagle's a big bird, pretty strong bird. It can make a nest anywhere. When I first got to this church, I hadn't seen it in several years, but when I first got to this church, one of the coolest things was when I parked on this side of the church right here. When I got out every morning, if I looked back toward those woods right there, there was a dead tree that was sticking up real high, and there was a hawk sitting on it almost every morning. And I could look up, I could see a hawk sitting up on that thing real high up there, and I'm like, that's cool and all. I mean, they can fly, but why? It doesn't have to go that high. It's a pretty strong bird. It's a bird of prey. It can branch on any one of those branches out there, but it goes up high. And then look what God said. Those things can go way up high and still see their food way down low and swoop down and get them. And he says to Job, do you know why that's possible? Do you know why they do that? And again, a zoologist can say, well, they got great eyes. They got it. Yeah, they do. But why do they have them? Do I know the intricate workings of how these animals work? What's going on in their instinctive traits? In other words, no, we don't know that. Who knows? God knows. Who is the only one that knows? God knows. And so God's point in asking Job about each one of these animals is this. Even upon careful examination, there's a lot of things about their individual characteristics that we can't explain. I can look at them, I can observe them, I can make characteristic statements about them, but I can't explain it. I can't explain it. And that's true for us with all our scientific knowledge and all that. We don't know. So for reasons unknown to Job, God allowed each one of these animals to experience what God's will was for each one of these animals. That's God's will. God has a will for that eagle. He has a will for that mountain goat. God has a will for the sloth. Why does the sloth move so slow? I have no earthly idea, but it does. And God has a purpose so that that animal, that sloth, instinctively will live out God's will for its life. That's what it does. It's instinctive. It just knows. I've always told y'all, the only one I would debate's a cat. They're just rogue creatures that are out to get you for some reason. I don't know. I mean, they're vicious little critters. Everything else has a purpose, except for them. But why do they do it? I don't know. God, He didn't tell us that. We're not privy to that. We can make these characteristic observations, but we don't know. All we know is every animal that you see out there, animals in the ocean, sharks and dolphins and stingrays and birds of the air and the land animals that God created on specific days of creation, each one of them instinctively, they can't reason, they're not made in the image of God, instinctively, they live every day of their life following the will of their Creator. That's how God made them to be. And so his point's going to be to Job when we get on into this. He's going to say, Job, I made you with the same kind of purpose, except you have a ability to reason and think. You have something that those animals don't have. You're not driven on pure instinct. You have an ability to choose to follow me. You could choose to do that. You can choose to submit to my authority. You have a choice. They don't. I put that in their DNA. They have to do it. But not you. And so there's a reason. There's a purpose for your life. Even the purpose in suffering. Now here, I'll say this kind of in conclusion, these two chapters. Here's what's good for us, frustrating for Job. Do we know why Job went through all this? Yeah, we do. We can read the first two chapters and know why Job went through it. Job went through all this so that Job could prove his innocence. I mean, God could prove his innocence. God is trying to say to Satan, Job will serve me for nothing. Even though Job's being blessed and having all these things, Job will still serve me. And so you and I read that in the first two chapters. God said, I had this conversation with Satan. Satan said, I'm trying to find somebody. God said, if you consider Job, he'll withstand it. Satan said, you put a hedge around him. God said, I'll drop it temporarily. And now you can take his stuff. And then he said, well, I can't take his person. God said, well, now you can do that. Just don't kill him. And so he did all these things. We know that. Job didn't. Job didn't get to read the first two chapters of his life before all this happened. He woke up one morning and it all happened. And so he was not privy to this. Me and you are. And why did God allow us now to read this? So that we can know that sometimes similar situations take place in our life like this. That God is testing us. God is putting us through something in order to prove to himself and to us that we can be resilient. We can be faithful. In other words, listen to me. You don't have to give up. You don't have to stop. And if 2 Kings chapter 3 is any teacher for us, it's never, ever, ever too late to stop and ask for help. You can always do that because you have the ability to think. You have the ability to reason. You have the ability to know God. These animals don't. And so God is trying to say to Job, listen, I love you. I care for you. But you're not as smart as you think you are. You think you have answers for all this. But that's not true. And so this is going to continue now. Chapter 40 is going to be the concluding challenge, God's concluding challenge. And then, starting in chapter 41 and 42, God is going to show Job his incredible power. And he's going to talk about different bigger creatures. And he's going to say, I have power over those too. So in other words, don't question too much what you don't understand, and don't always try to presume to know what God is thinking. In other words, so we'll stop right there, and our